Well, hello, fellow tent pros. Welcome to the Pitchin Tents podcast, brought to you by Top Tech Event Tents with your host, Bryan Bolt.
And Davis West here. We got a pretty special one today, Bryan, don't we?
This is our first guest that we've had, and I've been looking forward to this one. It's taken us a little bit to get it put together for a lot of reasons, schedules, internet issues, etc. But we are live and good to go today. We have none other than Mr. Peter McVey with us today. How you doing, Pete?
Hey, I'm doing wonderful. I'm glad we're through the technical issues because this old guy doesn't work very well with that kind of stuff.
Yeah, this is a first. Normally Davis and I are in the same physical location. Today I'm on the road. Davis is back at the plant. Pete's obviously remote as well. So we're gonna tag team this thing, and we're gonna talk about pole tents today. We're gonna get in the guts of a variety of pole tents, what pole tents are, where their place is in the market, and then none other more qualified than Pete to talk about pole tents. Pete, a lot of people know that Pete's helped us with our tent school for more than the amount of time, over 20 years, more than the time that I've been at Top Tech. And Pete is normally the one who teaches the pole tent sessions. Pete, before we get into specifics and in the guts of it, so to speak, why don't you tell everybody a little bit about Pete McVey, for those that may not know, and who you are, where you came from, and what you're doing these days.
Yeah, who is the infamous Pete McVey?
All right, who am I? Why am I here? What do I know? And how much vinyl flows through the veins in my body? That's what we're going to get after here. So I am a 40-plus year veteran of tent rental. Started my career as a young man, 16, 17, 18 years old, and finally quit when I was in my early to mid-60s. So quite a long run. As far as history goes, I got my start in the rental business through my church. Kind of a strange way to get into the tent rental business, but I'll explain it to you here. Part of the fellowship within my church for the men of our church was that we were tasked with setting up the church picnic. And what that process amounted to was we rented a truck or borrowed some pickup trucks, and we headed south about 30 miles, and we picked up these big tents from a regional tent renter, and we brought them back to our church parking lot, set them up, and we had what was affectionately known as the Beers for Jesus Festival. So I totally enjoyed that whole thing. The idea that we could take a blank canvas, the parking lot, turn it into a festival was just amazing to me. And naturally, being 17, 18 years old, there was a lot of party on my brain. And I was like, wow, look at this party. So after that event, the Lord blessed us with very good weather for the setup, the event, and the takedown. And I thought to myself, that was really easy. I wonder how I could make a living doing this, combining party with venues, with tents, and being 18 years old. This sounds like heaven to me. Well, be careful what you wish for, folks. You don't know. So how did I get in the tent business? After 2 years of doing this with the men of the church group, I noticed one thing, that the majority of these guys were what I am now, an old guy, lots of gray hair, physically not quite as fit as I used to be, and so on. So I approached them and I said, hey, I'm young. I'm 18, 19 years old. How about I provide the tents and you just pay me a rental for them? And after a little bit of discussion, they thought that was a great idea, and my church became my first customer. The problem was I didn't own a tent, nor did I own any furniture or any of the other equipment needed to put on this festival. So that led me to, let's get in the tent business. So I searched around, found a tent manufacturer. And like I'd like to tell everybody, back then in the late 70s, early 80s, the only thing I really needed to get into the rental business was the ability to write my name on the bottom of a piece of paper, a check. For that check, I received a 40 by 120 foot tent and one 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper that had some handwritten instructions on it as to how to put this tent up. So that was the beginning of my saga. 40 some odd years later, I had grown this business from that single tent to 250 plus pieces of vinyl, 10,000 chairs, thousands of tables, basically everything that could go underneath a tent with the exception of food and liquor. Anything to serve that, to serve the guests, or to make a party, we provide it. So I turned it into a full-service event company. Totally enjoyed it. Totally enjoyed the run. Back in 2018, it came to an end, not by my choice, but by the choice of misfortunate accident next door in the building that I was in. The tenant in the unit next to me had this massive fire in his warehouse. Firewalls did their job. We didn't have any flame on our side, but we did have a lot of smoke damage. The insurance company came to me and said, "You're 98% destroyed. You have two choices. Here's some money. Go start your business again. Here's some money. Get an umbrella drink. Put your toes in the sand." I chose the at 80-something. I just didn't see the value reopening the business and then trying to get out of it or sell it or whatever at the end of my run. I did not get the umbrella drink and the toes in the sand. I basically took 1/2 of a year, 6 to 7 months off, and I did nothing but focus on my second favorite hobby, which is racing stock cars. And I spent that time traveling all over Wisconsin racing and stayed involved in the tent rental industry as a mentor, a teacher. As Bryan explained, I've been coming to South Carolina and helping out with that tent school for 20 plus years. I also work with many of the different organizations that support the tent manufacturing and the tent rental industry as an educational person, helping with conventions, helping with different educational opportunities, and so on and so forth. Currently, I'm a consultant in the tent industry. I do private education for tent rental companies. I work with several tent manufacturers on an educational end of things, and I also work with one tent manufacturer in new product development and quality control. So still involved in the tent rental world. I'm not putting them up as a rental from a rental standpoint on a regular basis, but I am out in the field probably 50% of the year installing tents for either clients of tent rental or tent manufacturers, or helping with tent rental companies with maybe personnel issues or procedural issues and that type of thing. So focus has always been pole tents. The first 10 years of my rental business, I did not even own a frame tent. Didn't like them, didn't understand them, didn't want them. Focused on pole tents, became very, very good at it. Kind of became sort of a
Guru
professional expert, will, and moved on from there. So that's the story of Pete McVey. I'm still in the tent rental business, or in the tent rental world, in the tent manufacturing world. And like I tell everybody, I've got a lot of vinyl flowing through my veins. I carry blood around. I carry vinyl around in my veins. So that's where I'm at. That's what I'm up to.
Yeah, we
Pete,
really
would you
appreciate
agree-
you coming on for sure, because you have a plethora of knowledge that you can pass on to this next generation of tent guys. And I know for a fact, whenever you came to tent school for us, I remember the first time I ever met you, I told Bryan, like, who is this guy? And then about halfway through the day, I was like, this guy knows more about tents than everybody here combined when it comes to a pole tent. So yeah, we appreciate you coming on and sharing some knowledge. What you got, Bryan?
Well, I was going to say, now that Pete is on this side of the table, so to speak, on the manufacturing side, I'm the one guy in the room that's not been on the other side. You now that Davis and Pete have both been on both sides of the table, having spent time in the field. And then, I've always worked out on the manufacturing side. Pete, would you agree that it looks a little different sitting on this side of the table?
Well, absolutely. It's two different viewpoints. And tell you what, Bryan, I do have a suggestion for you. I understand you are quite the continental United States traveler, and you have hit almost every one of the 48 states with the exception of Wisconsin. So I have you up to Wisconsin next summer, and I'll hook you up with a tent rental guy and let you run for a month in Wisconsin to learn what that side of the table is all about.
That sounds like a great idea, Bryan. You should definitely get that side of the experience.
Let's not fool ourselves and think that Bryan has never put up a tent just because I said that, because I have certainly put up my share. So, the difference is too, we do it the right way.
Oh yeah.
So,
yeah, you've never had the experience of one under the gun, though.
I'm kidding. I'm kidding. So, Anyway, Pete, let's dive into some styles of specifically. Let's get in the gut, so to speak, of the different styles of pole tents. And let's start with the most basic, which is commonly known as the party canopy. Some people call them the OTC or over the counter. Do you want to talk about those just for a minute?
Yeah, Brian, the party canopy over the counter tent, wonderful tent. It's a lighter duty tent than some of the big tents that you see at weddings and tent sales and things like that. Made out of a little lighter duty, not lighter duty, but lighter weight vinyl material. Typically, the poles that support it are made out of a thinner gauge aluminum, and they are typically a multi-piece pole so that this package can be very compact and transportable. The OTC part of it stands for over the counter. It basically describes the fact that a person can go to a rental store and rent one of these tents, and it will be given to you in a package that fits into your SUV, soccer mom van type of a vehicle. You don't need a big commercial truck to move it. You don't need any real heavy equipment to install it. It becomes a very user-friendly tent. It is without some of the reinforcements and some of the things that we put into the larger tents for strength and to meet engineering. It is a non-engineered structure. That doesn't mean it's not safe. It is a very safe structure used as it is intended to be used. Short-term, small. Party canopies typically max out at around 20 by 40, maybe 30 by 30. You generally don't see them built out of this particular vinyl or these lighter duty poles, much larger sizes than that. So wonderful piece of equipment. I started with them, and the only reason I did, of course, was cost. Is it cheaper or less expensive than a commercial grade tent? But it does just a wonderful, wonderful job of filling that niche in the market. One other thing I wanted to mention about it was the fact that the tie downs that are used to hold these tents to the ground are typically rope, and they typically have something called a dog bone or a slider on the end of the rope so that you don't have to learn knots. You don't have to become this tent guy that understands how to put the tent up. You drive the stakes in the ground, you hook the rope on, and you use the slider to tension it out.
Yep.
Very easy, very simple, wonderful product. From there, unless you have anything to add to that, take the same basic design tent and we upgrade the vinyl, we upgrade the poles, and we make the tents larger. Now, of course, as the tent gets larger, it becomes heavier and harder to handle. So what we've done is we've now made what's called a sectional tent.
Yep.
So these tents now are made up of a minimum of two pieces, an end and an end, and you put the two ends together, and that makes your base tent. And then you can add middle sections to it to make the tent longer. These tents typically are heavier, thicker vinyl. They typically have more reinforcement in them. They have heavier side poles, heavier center poles, and usually the rope is gone. And it's been replaced with a webbing and a mechanical ratchet device to tighten the tent to the ground. This is typically your definition of a commercial rental grade or rental tent, being a sectional tent, being of the heavier vinyl and heavier components.
Pete, let me jump in real quick, and I want to point out two things, and specifically at Top Tech, I can kind of explain how we handle. I want to back up the party canopy just for a second, and just because we do it a little bit different, because our party canopy is built a little heavier than most. We have a 2-inch webbing that runs around the perimeter, and our philosophy is, since those are primarily over the counter, and these days, people, let's be honest, people aren't renting tents over the counter like they did 15, 20 years ago. Now, right. Most people aren't going to, with the safety concerns that we all have and how people put things together and install tents and the anchoring issues that we've seen over time, a lot of people don't allow other folks to go, rental companies don't allow other folks to go and rent those so much over the counter. But anyway, we build our party canopy with some structural heavier webbings than a lot. So we're not necessarily going to be the cheapest option, But our philosophy is that we're giving you a tent that it's going to be hard for your customers to pull apart, right? So, and then we also offer that all the way up to a 30 by 60, which is unheard of. We don't sell a whole lot of 30 by 60 pole tents one piece because that's just a lot of material for somebody to deal with, right?
Yep.
And then when
that,
we start going to sectional, go ahead.
You say that, but I just quoted 4 of them today. 30,
Well, there
60
you go.
pulls.
There you go. So then we go into the sectional party canopy for us, and we call it our expo, which it would have the same center pole heights as the party canopy. I essentially say that it's a sectional version of the party canopy before we get into the bigger tension tents, which are epics and citations that a lot of people know about. But yeah, so sectional pole tents are huge just from the simple sense of flexibility. And one thing I'll point out too is when we talk about these midsections, you'll most often find that the midsections are in increments of half the width. So like a 20 wide tent is going to have a 10-foot mid, a 30 wide is going to have a 15, a 40 is a 20, etc. Right?
Yeah.
So
and
you don't have a lot of mid flexibility in a pole tent like you would in a comparably sized frame tent.
Right. And something else to point out too is once you get to these bigger sectional tents, when you think of sectional, the first thing you think of is, well, how do they attach to each other? The majority of the time it's going to be a looping grommet. So you'll have loop on one side, grommet on the other in your mids. And then on your ends, you'll have one loop end and one grommet end. And that's how you get your start to the tent, say a 40-40, for example.
Pete, would you say that connection is pretty tried and true, right? That's how pretty much all the different manufacturers are. It's pretty basic, pretty easy,
but
and
strong.
highly durable.
Yep.
Yeah, exactly. All of the above. And I will also mention that over the course of the last 4 years, I have seen 3 or 4 different attempts to change the grommet and loop system. Some of them using steel clasp type thing that can connect the tent. I've seen people use plastic zippers. I've seen using a double-sided keter. So all kinds of different ways to skin that same cat. But it seems like everybody reverts back to the grommet and loop. It's tried, it's true,
Yep.
it's key, and very, very strong. So I think we're going to stay for the time being.
I was about to say, don't fix something that's not broke, right?
Exactly. But we always will try.
Well, that's part of our industry. We're tinkerers. We always got to find the next best thing and see if something can work a little bit better. But sometimes you just got to revert back to old history and say, okay, this is the way to do it.
So, Pete, certainly in your time, you've seen the how the industry has progressed from these basic, simple. Way back when it was canvas, right? And then vinyl came along with these newer type, more advanced materials that are a lot more user-friendly, durable, all that, a flame retardant. And then as a progression of those pole tents, now we see things that are commonly called tension tents or engineered pole tents. For us, that would be our Epic line of tents. A lot of people are familiar with. Pete, I know you've had some experience with the Epics yourself in the past, and they are, for a lot of reasons, they're really, really, really durable tents. I always say they're about as bulletproof of a workhorse type pole tent as you get, because and Pete, you can get into the guts of it a little bit, but I can say too that they have, when you look at the outside of a tension tent and it looks like it's just material being stretched. Not really true. We have bones in that tent, so to speak, with 12,000-pound webbings that run throughout and create an internal structure, right? You've seen that progression, I'm sure, over your years, correct?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, when I started in this business, I started with a pair of canvas tents on wooden poles. And believe it or not, we had these tapered wooden stakes that we had to drive into. And that's what I started with. Those tents were built out of a canvas material. They had some webbing and reinforcements. And actually, I got to take that back. They didn't have webbing. They used rope sewn into the canvas for the reinforcement. And as we transitioned from that period of time, in I'm going to guess the late 70s, early 80s is when vinyl started to make an appearance in our industry. And a lot of us old guys were a little bit skeptical of that. It was, unfortunately, we looked at it and said, who wants a plastic tent? How strong can a plastic tent be? Built this out of plastic. What's wrong with canvas? We don't like change. Well, we love change because these plastic tents, they're actually vinyl, but these plastic tents have been phenomenal. The benefits in the manufacturing of them, the efficiencies of manufacturing, the techniques that manufacturers are using now with radio frequency welding and that type of thing to bond the vinyls together, eliminate the leakage that we used to have with the canvas tents. The seams don't leak anymore because things are now welded together and not sewn. We have, as you alluded to, 12,000-pound breaking strength webbing inside in the places that are needed in these tents. We also now have engineering in the tents where the tents have actually been exposed to stress analysis. Oh, that's a tough word. Stress analysis. They've been exposed to true design and architecture, that type of thing that has made this a very strong, very beautiful, and very safe structure. So as all of these things have evolved, our product has gotten better, allows for our installations to be better and safer for the end user. So it's definitely been a wonderful trip from canvas into the plastic or vinyl world. From one piece to sectional tents has been fantastic. And now we've come all the way around. And like I like to tell people, I just mentioned before, I started with canvas, wood poles, and wood stakes. And I have gone all the way around the globe once, and I'm right back where I started with a sailcloth. A sailcloth tent was something that was put together by a guy by the name of Sperry on the east coast of the United States. He was a sailmaker, a true sailmaker. He built sails for sailboats. And he was approached by a friend of his that was having a daughter getting married. And, hey, could you build me a tent for this? So Mr. Sperry took that project on and used the materials that he had, and he built a tent. Well, that tent turned out to be so popular that he rented it again and again and again, and got to the point where his son decided, you know what? We should have a company called the Sperry Sailcloth Tent Manufacturer. And they continued to rent and manufacture tents built out of this sailcloth material, which in effect was a canvas. They also stuck to the wood poles at the center pole, wood poles at the side poles. Thank God they decided to go to steel stakes because those wood stakes were and get in. So we have seen over the course of the last 40 years quite a number of different innovations and changes in design, in the quality of the ingredients, if you will, the fabrics that we use, the aluminum that we use, and so on. So it's been, like in my case, it's been around the globe once, and I'm right back where I started. So I'm very interested to see what's going to be next.
Well, as manufacturers, we all try to do something a little bit different, right? Just to keep pushing the industry. But at the end of the day, when you get in some of these pole tents and tension tents, those tried and true designs, there's a reason why people carry so much of that inventory because they just work.
Yes.
At the end of the day, they just work.
And the beautiful thing about that tension tent, whether it's a single pole tent or whether it's a twin pole or even a triple pole, is it is the most incredibly beautiful workhorse that you've ever seen. And I don't know how many other things in this world you can define as an incredibly beautiful workhorse. But that's what our tents are. They do the job day in and day out. They're very beautiful, very appealing to the eye, and most importantly, very appealing to the bride's mother. So, very, very wonderful product.
I always say too, there's an element of instant gratification too for us guys that go something about putting up a big pole tent is, we've done 80 by 130 in 3.5 hours.
Yeah.
You know, it was an open ball field when we got there. The first stake comes off the truck, and the next thing you know, 3.5 hours later, you've got an 80 by 130 standing there, and it's pretty satisfying, gratifying, right?
Absolutely. Like you can bounce
And I
a
think-
quarter off of it too.
Yeah, both of you guys have been out in the field. Both of you guys are trainers just like me. And I know that you have seen the look on the faces of, I'm going to call them rookie installers, or installers that have never done an 80-foot wide tent.
Yep.
They've maybe done 20 wide tents. They've maybe done 30 wide tents. And when they get done with that 80-foot wide tent, the look on their face and the pride in their step of what they have just built is amazing.
Makes it worth it.
Yeah. Let's talk about these tension tents in a little bit real quick. I wanted to get into exactly what it is, what's different about them. We already talked about the webbings. The other thing that most often you're going to see on these bigger tension tents is a way that those webbings share the load. So those are plates. Typically, I know Top Tech, I can't speak for everyone. I think a lot of people do it this way, but we use a powder-coated aluminum plate that's white, so it maintains the color of the tent. But then those plates are at the interface where a side pole, say, comes through the top, or even at the center pole up at the top. Most often specifically for us, we use those plates on the side pole positions, because with that Epic, we pull from the point of the valance instead of the position where the side pole comes through the top. So you have to have something, since we're pulling on the webbing, so we don't pull that tent apart. Those webbings have to tie into something. So from our standpoint, most of the time you'll see those webbing sewn into a plate, which takes the load off the grommet where the side pole comes through, right? And then you'll see a different type of plate in the corners, but that's just as a way to transmit that load through the tent. And that's ultimately why Davis was talking about, you can bounce a quarter off these tops. That's why they're slick and tight and they don't have wrinkles, is because those webbings through the plates are allowed to transmit those loads throughout the vinyl, and you're not pulling on the vinyl per se.
Right. It spreads the load for you.
I was just going to make another comment that what you have just defined or described is absolutely true. The other thing with a tension tent, if you look at them, usually the fabric is cut and welded together. The panels are welded together in a different direction than a normal pole tent. And changing the direction of the vinyl, that increases the ability for it to be put under tension to create that top that is so tight and taut that you could bounce a quarter off of it.
Yep. That's a good point.
And then what we have to do is, because there's so much tension, like, Pete, you've seen the loads on these tents like this, in the case of, let's say, a 40 or 60 wide engineered pole tent, for us, our Epic, those things will need multiple thousands of pounds, specifically at lace lines and corners, which usually take the most of the heat when it comes to the amount of tension that you have to put on the perimeter of the tent. So we have to connect those perimeters with something mechanically. So those webbings that run around the perimeter of the tent, they tie into webbings, and you've got, in the case of a lace line, or webbings, in the case of a lace line, you've got two plates, stacked on top of each other, but still that has to be mechanically connected. So you'll see typically a D-ring with a carabiner or something to connect those webbings so that load stays connected along the perimeter. So a lot of the different manufacturers have other, different ways of doing it, but at the end of the day, it's reaching the same goal, I guess I should say.
So what described there is what I try to tell people when we're learning about tents, is that my definition of a tent is to make the sum of all of the parts equal one. So another, taking the tent top, poles, the stakes, the web guides, the internal webbing that's built into the tent, the plates, the mechanical connections at the lace lines in themselves. We're taking all of those components and we're trying to combine them into one unit that works together across all environments. That's basically what we're doing. And I think if you want to know the difference between a tension tent and a regular pole tent, or a party canopy, if you will, is the fact that you're doing the same thing. You're combining all of the parts, but on a tension tent, you're putting it under much more pressure or tension. You're stretching it tighter to resist the elements of Mother Nature, the wind, the rain, the hail, the snow, and so on. And by combining all of these parts together and putting them under tension, it creates a single unit that is able to resist Mother Nature better than the same unit that's not under the same tension.
That's a good segue too, Pete. I was thinking that we quite often, and Davis, you're probably the same way as far as some of the questions we get from customers, and somebody will say, when they're evaluating, say, a frame tent versus a pole tent, they go, which one's stronger? Isn't the frame tent stronger? Not necessarily. Some of these tension tents are engineered for higher wind loads than some equivalently sized frames. So just because there's a framework under there doesn't mean that it's necessarily more that it's stronger. That it's I've seen some of our pole tents have more than 70-mile-an-hour wind loads on a 40 or 60 wide pole tent.
Yeah, and that'll all be dependent on the ground soil too. There.
Well, one of the things that I would have to say with respect to that remark is also, I think some people look at a frame tent and they say, well, look, it stands up with no stakes at all. We can do less staking. Tent will stand versus a pole tent, which requires a lot of staking in order for the tent to take its shape and maintain its shape. And I think when some people compare frame tent and pole tent of the same size and they ask that question, which is stronger, I usually lean toward the pole tent as being stronger, because you can't put up a pole tent and cheat on the staking where you up a frame tent and cheat on the staking. And then when Mother Nature blows, you're in trouble.
That's a great point.
Very good point. Yep. So when you look at the engineering on our bigger pole tents or epics that we're talking about, typically you'll see two values at each out guide position. One is the initial load. In other words, the amount of tension that position around the tent has to see just for the tent to maintain its shape, like to your point, Pete. And then you'll have a secondary value that's under wind load. What's the proof strength that you have to maintain at that, which is ultimately, let's clear the air right now. It's ultimately the installer's responsibility, because I can give you a tent that's engineered, but I can't tell you what the ground conditions are. And we're not going to get into anchoring today, because that's a whole nother topic for another time. But when we look at the two loads on a tent, you've got an initial load and then what they call a proof load. Or let's say the tent's, I'm just throwing out a number, let's say the tent's engineered for 70 miles an hour. What is that position on that tent experiencing at a 70-mile-an-hour 3-second gust?
I'm glad I'm in my house. That's all I got to say.
Yep, that's right. So,
you are absolutely right there. There are several numbers to consider. You touched on soil condition, then you touched on the value needed to make the tent take its shape, and then you have touched on the value of at what wind speed do you want this tent to continue to hold its shape, and at what speed are all bets off. Most manufacturers in this industry are somewhere between 50 and 90 miles an hour. I don't want to speak to what the standard is right now, because I don't know it off the top of my head. But I guess what anybody listening to this should really understand is we are building tents in our industry to withstand 50 to 90 mile an hour, 3-second gusts. The question that I always have is, or what you should take out of this is, we are building a very strong structure, but at what point is it miserable to be outside or even under a tent at 50, 60, 70 mile an hour wind gusts? There really is no reason that anybody should be outside under a tent, or even outside, period, in those kind of winds. But I guess what we need to take away from that is we're engineering things over and above what the actual use would ever be in these tents. We as an industry like to have any human beings evacuated and off to a safe haven at somewhere between 38 and 40 miles an hour of wind speed. So you can see right there, we are 10 to 12 miles an hour under the minimum 50 mile an hour engineered, and we're way under the 90 mile an hour. So you have no fear of the tent collapsing, no fear of that happening. But what you do have to worry about is not so much how hard the wind blows, but what the wind blows. Get people to a safe haven before the lawn chairs and the garbage cans and trees and branches and things start blowing around and become projectiles. So that being said, I think that anybody looking at tents should be looking at that 50 to 90 mile an hour range. 3-second gust is pretty much become the standard testing, and please evacuate at 38 to 40 miles an hour and put an end to your event, get people to the safe haven.
Yep. Nobody's life is worth that.
Yep.
One thing I wanted to talk about while we're at it is we start talking about these bigger tents, and specifically, let's say 60 wide and larger. And all tents, I always tell customers when we're talking about it, so, tents are driven by width, because what comes later is typically a function of the width of the tent and how you gain length. But when we start dealing with 60 wide and larger, then we start going to optional twin pole versions of these tents. So I know we make that Epic in both a single pole and a twin pole version in 60 and 80 wide. So what does that mean? So when you talk about a twin pole tent, that is, you have to look at the twin pole as, and not everybody knows this, that's why I want to cover it. A twin pole is referenced, the single pole versus twin pole is referenced standing at the width of the tent. So if we're in a 60 wide tent, standing on that 60-foot end of the tent, looking down the length, do you see one or two rows of poles going away from you, right? So a 60 by 90 single pole has two poles. So we've had it happen before where you got a 60 by 90 with two center poles, and somebody goes, it's a 60 by 90 twin pole. No, it has two poles in it, but that's not a twin pole. So just wanted to cover that for everybody to make sure that the folks listen to this to understand what the difference is when we reference single pole versus twin pole.
Another way that you can describe that is if you stand at the end of a tent and you're looking down the length of the tent, if the poles are in the middle of that span, it's a single pole tent.
Yep.
If a pair of poles running down that tent, or even 3 poles running down that tent, it is a twin pole tent. Yep. So down the length of the tent is what you want to consider there.
Yep.
And it's an interesting question. What is the preference, single pole or double pole? When would you use a single pole? When would you use a double pole? And I'm not sure I can give you the answers to that. I thought at one point in time I knew every answer to that question. And when I finally thought I knew everything about it, somebody would throw me another curveball and say, well, what about this? And again, I would be stumped. So I don't know exactly why or what would cause you to purchase a twin pole versus a single pole, or a single pole versus a twin pole. Some of it has to do with what the use of the tent is going to be. Is it for a party gathering gala type thing where you may have things in the middle of the tent that a single pole tent would interfere with? And therefore, let's use a double pole tent so the middle of the center of the tent is open. That is one possibility. But then that leads to, if you have a row of single poles down the center of the tent and you put a stage at the end of the tent, now that pole is in the middle of the stage. So you use a twin pole tent there. I don't know if you want to add to that as far as why people would use one versus the other. I don't believe either one is stronger than the other. My personal preference, the double pole is easier to install if you're doing it by hand than a single pole tent, because you have 2 poles to actually lift the vinyl off the ground versus a single pole. But from your perspective, have you found a common denominator as to why somebody would want a double pole versus a single, or a single versus a double?
I see it just more of aesthetically. I mean, like you said, that middle aisle, for a lot of people, having a middle aisle down a tent is one of the most important things for them, because, i.e., a bride walking down the middle of an aisle doesn't want to have to dodge a center pole that's right in the center. like you also said, when it comes to putting a stage or dance floor in there, you typically would like to have that stage or dance floor in the center somewhere in the tent. So with that twin pole, it would allow you for that room to do such, whereas you wouldn't have that single center pole running down the whole length of the tent, dead center of the tent.
Right on. I will say too that in all things constant, and let's be honest, this is typically a 60 wide conversation, right? When you get 80 wide, it's pretty much too much tent to do a single. I don't know of anybody that makes a single wide, single pole version of an 80. That's a lot of material to carry with one single center pole across the width. So it's usually a 60 wide conversation, single versus twin pole. And there's one thing I will say. Equivalently sized, let's say square footage wise, a twin pole is going to be more expensive, all things being constant. A twin pole is going to be more expensive than a equivalently sized single pole tent, just because the extra poles, the extra materials, and the extra labor to build that tent. As a percentage, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but you're probably talking, I'd guess as much as 20 to 30% more for equivalently sized twin pole. Plus you got twice as many poles under the tent, whether or not they're in the middle. That's a whole conversation I tell our customers, those are certain questions we can't answer for them. Right.
Yep. But either way you look at it, both of them are equivalent strength wise, size wise. They are exactly the same. Looks slightly different. A single pole will have a different look than a twin pole. They're still going to be white for the most part, but I guess it's really floor plan specific in what you're going to be using the tent for.
Yeah.
You need to have a twin pole if you're going to have a tent sale out in a parking lot. No, you could use a single pole because those poles aren't going to make any difference. So it is kind of use specific. Me as an installer, I prefer the twins versus the singles. But now in this day and age, with all of the mechanical equipment that we have to install tents, it really doesn't make a whole lot of difference. If you're pushing center poles up with a machine, it doesn't matter if you're doing singles or doubles. If you're doing it by hand, it kind of makes a difference.
I was about to say, I can remember putting that twin pole 60 wide up by hand, and it's a little bit harder to do than a single 30 wide pole, But nowadays they have these tent oxes and everything else, and the pole tent's basically the easiest one to do now because you do everything with the machine.
Yes, sir. That's absolutely true.
Let's get into some installation tactics real quick. We've talked about the different styles and types generally of the pole tents that are out there. Pete, this is one thing that you've spent a lot of time talking about in your sessions when you teach tent school, and honestly, getting down to the bottom line, between you and Mike Tharp, when I first originally started in this business, I learned how to install any of these tents through basically the two of you guys, and the philosophy of whether or not you square a tent versus a stake line. You care to get into that? That's a little polarizing conversation sometimes, but I know where you stand, and I'm in agreement. But why don't you tell everybody
stand
what
behind
your thoughts
Pete
are?
Here too, for sure. Go ahead and lay the ball down, Pete.
So it's interesting that you bring that up, because many, 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 many years ago, I was asked by the folks at the American Rental Association to participate in a group of fellow professionals in designing their tent installation course for their Certified Event Rental Professionals program, the CERP program. And I got together with probably 10 other tent installers. The majority of them were based on the East Coast. And would you know it? I found out that the East Coast guys do things differently than the Midwest guys. And it got to be that very polarizing discussion. And I'm going to say more headbutting than anything else, that this is the way we've always done it. And Mr. McVey, I'm not sure we understand what you're trying to propose to us, and this type of thing. And it got to be quite a lively discussion. Do you square the tent or do you square the stake line? My philosophy is, I could care less about the tent. I need to make the foundation perfect in order for my tent to be perfect.
Mm-hmm.
So my philosophy is that you always square the stake line. You use rulers, you use the diagrams provided by the manufacturer, and everything is squared mathematically so that all the stakes go into the ground where they belong. And then you take the tent and you put it within or inside of that box that you built on the ground with the stakes. And if you do that, if there is an imperfection in the tent, you're able to correct it while you're setting it up. In other words, if, for God forbid, the manufacturer made a mistake and maybe some of the pull spacing was slightly off, or maybe you have to move something to clear an underground obstacle, a gas line or a water line, so you have to move a stake slightly one way or another. Much easier to do without the tent. Do it with the ruler and the drawing that you have, and lay that out, and then drop your tent inside of that box. When you go to stand your tent up, it will go up perfect the first time, every time. Now, on the other side of the coin, the other way of doing things is there are a lot of people that will spend the time to put the vinyl on the ground and square it, and use rulers and so on to actually square that tent so that that 40 by 80 piece of vinyl on the ground is truly 40 by 80. And then they work off of that to get the stake location. My problem with that procedure is, as the tents get bigger, it is virtually impossible for your tent crew to stretch that tent to its true dimension. So now you have to take some shortcuts or some assumptions as to where you're going to put the stakes in the ground, because your guys can only get that 60-foot tent pulled to 58 feet because of the amount of webbing and the amount of vinyl that's in the tent. It just makes it impossible to actually pull the tent square. So if we ignore the tent and we do the stakes first, and then we take the tent and put it inside of the stakes, the ratchets and the webbing that we use to tie it down is more than sufficient to pull that extra 2 feet out, so that now your 60-foot tent is truly 60 feet. That's my personal preference. The second reason is we're working outside. We're working against and with Mother Nature. Mother Nature decided that today it's going to rain all day. Well, if any of you have ever had a tent on the ground, the vinyl on the ground when it's raining, and trying to put it into the air, you know how heavy things can become when they fill with water. So the staking method, or squaring the stake line method, allows you to not even take your vinyl off the truck while it's raining. You can go out, and believe it or not, guys, you're not made of sugar. You're not going to melt. You can stand out in the rain and you can drive stakes in the ground until the weather clears, and then you can put the tent up. Using the other method of the tent to locate the stakes, now you're kind of screwed with that swimming pool of water that you have to dump off as you go into the air. So,
Pete, I've seen a lot of times where our bigger customers, they'll have a crew that can go out when they've got multiple sites working, let's say over a particular weekend. They've got a crew that's going around, and just a pickup truck with a couple of tape measures, they have a couple of guys going to the sites and laying these things out. So when the crew that's there to stake the tent, they show up and start dropping stakes.
Yep, I was about to say the same thing, Bolt. I mean, that's the great thing about squaring the stake line, is you can do it without even having the tent on site. And say you have 4 of those to put up, if you send the crew out there the day before and go ahead and lay your stake line out, that cuts down on the labor time in the field the next day as well.
percent.
And I can tell you too, a lot of the guys that are driving oxes these days and pounding stakes don't necessarily want to get off of it long enough to take time to lay out a stake line. So it's good to have a couple of people go out in front and do that. And the other thing that I say too is, we talk about pole tents being a little more art than science. This is a way to make it more scientific in terms of the way that they go up. And it's very much, it's just math, right?
Yep.
And it's pretty simple,
Geometry.
basic stuff, and it's just simple geometry, the way that Pete and us train it. So, and my thing is too, Pete, one last thing, and I'll let you continue, but I always say, when we train this way, and you look at it from the standpoint of training your crews, when we train this way, I train a crew to do a 20, it doesn't matter if it's a 20 wide party canopy or an 80 by 130, 160 pole tent, it's all the same.
Absolutely. That's what I always tell my guys. Obviously, we start them out with the small stuff. And once they've accomplished 20 by 20 or 20 by 40 tent, I tell them, I said, you're ready to go. You're ready to do 80 wides. You're ready to do 60 wides because it's all the same.
Yep.
It's just bigger. Your poles are bigger. Your poles are taller. Your vinyl's bigger. Your vinyl's wider. But the whole process is exactly the same as when you started here as a rookie and you were doing 20 by 20s.
Yep.
It's exactly the same.
Yep. Pete, at what point would you say from installing, is there a rule of thumb that you would use? A lot of people in smaller operations are putting pole tents by hand. At what point you just absolutely wouldn't even attempt it? Is that 40 wide? Is that 60 wide? I have some thoughts on it, but I'll let you go first.
Well, my thought on it changed a little bit over the years. I was always 0 through 40 wide. We'd do those by hand all day long. And once we got above 40 wide, then we'd start looking at either some sort of a pulling device with a dolly that could be used on a center pole, or maybe a tractor, or now we have something called a tent ox, which is a articulated machine that has been adapted to the specific tasks of the tent rental. But the thing that changed my mind a long time ago that said, if you have the equipment, use it.
Yep.
I was working with another tent company on a very large job, and I was tasked with doing all of the 20 wide and 30 wide work on this particular property. And the company that I was working with was doing all of the 40, 60, and 80 work. Yeah, that's fine. I'm out putting up tents, having a great time. We had a 30 by 60 foot tent propped up on the side legs, and we were ready to put the center poles in. And my guys grabbed the center pole. They started walking them in, getting ready to put them in. And Ryan from the other tent crew happened to be driving by with his tractor, and he just headed right over to our tent, grabbed the bottom of that center pole with his tractor, and he pushed it up. And I was like, my eyes opened right up. It was like, need that tractor, but boy, was that easy.
Yeah.
Well, my kind of thought pattern changed. You don't need to be that macho man that is stronger than anybody else. If you have a machine and it's practical to transport it, use it.
Yep.
That's basically it. I have done 60 foot and 80 foot by hand. It's not fun.
No.
It's not a lot of fun. At that point, in 80, I like to see some sort of mechanical device to help with center poles.
It's heavy.
It's heavy.
Yeah. And, one of the biggest things that I see, and I had this conversation with somebody not long ago about the reason that sometimes people struggle with putting the center poles in by hand. Like we did them when I first started, we were training. That was before people had so many mechanical means, to your point a minute ago. But we would do a 60 wide pole tent all day by hand. But I was also trained to leave those side poles as slack as they could possibly be without falling over. And most people end up putting too much pre-tension in the tent. So they're effectively working against the tension of the tent just to get the center pole in place. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, they're fighting themselves at that point. When you have the corners too tight or lace slidings too tight when you go to put the center pole in, you are working against yourself in that tent when they're too tight.
Yep, absolutely. I try to train people that the first thing you need to look at is your weather conditions. If it's a calm day, you put that, when you initially prop that tent up before you put the center poles in, you want that thing as loose as it can possibly be without falling down. If you have some breeze or some wind where you can't leave it really, really loose, we try to get our side poles so that they are tipped in toward the center of the tent, approximately 1 to 2.5 feet from vertical, leaning in toward the center of the tent. And that gives you enough slack in the fabric to reasonably install, with a reasonable amount of effort to install the center poles. The more you stand those side poles and corner poles up closer to vertical, the harder it's going to be to put the center poles in, because as we talked about before, these for the most part now are tension tents. So the idea behind them is they must be under tension to get the right shape and to look right. And how do we do that? We tension through the side poles and through the guys. Well, if you stand them up straight, you're already putting tension in the tent, and it's just going to make the center poles not a very desirable job to install.
So, Pete, when we're talking about putting center poles in tents, I was trained to put them in from the end of the tent, but I've been on multiple installs with customers, and for whatever reason along the line, somebody told them that pole tents, you can install the side poles from the length of the tent or down the side. Do you have any kind of input on that? Is there a right and a wrong way about that? I've always trained from the end, but that was because that's the way I was trained.
Yep. And this is kind of a trick question. So the way I explain it is I would prefer the standard operating procedure to be you come in from the end of the tent and you work the length of the tent. And the reason for that is that as you're pushing the center poles up, you're stretching the fabric. You're stretching anything that's sewn or welded to the fabric. Well, there is I shouldn't say very little. There is less reinforcement. There's less webbing going from the center pole to the end of a tent than there is from the center pole to the side of the tent. So as you're going up from the end of the tent, that fabric stretches much more and with easier effort to get the center poles up than if you come in from the side. If you come in from the side, you are trying to stretch 2 pieces of fabric, 2 pieces of webbing, a rope line that makes the loop, the grommet and loop, and then also the brass grommets. So all of that, and the ring flap. So all of that makes it much less, or there's less give going in from the side. Can you do it either way, and is one way right or wrong? Absolutely. You can come in from any way you want, and neither is right or wrong. I just think less effort, standard operating procedure, come in from the end. There are always going to be times where you're working around obstacles, fences, buildings, depending on the location of the tent, maybe even wind. You got a heck of a windy day. You decide the tent to go up. You want to use the wind. Well, that means you're going to have to come in from the side in order to use the wind. So yes, it can be done. Preference, standard operating procedure from the end. But given the circumstances of the job, come in whatever way you need to.
I'm glad you mentioned the wind, because I was about to say that. That's something that you can use to your advantage when putting up a pole tent, because it in effect, if you've got everything staked down correctly, already like pre-installed the ratchets and everything, and you get a good gust of wind, it can actually help you lift that material up as the center pole comes in, making it easier to do by hand. One other thing I was going to point out when it comes to putting center poles in, that all you guys need to be conscious of, especially if you're using a machine putting it in, make sure that you are engaging the center pole into the donuts or whatever it is, the plate in the top of the tent, and make sure you get it in both of them as they overlap. I've seen so many times where somebody might get it in one and lift it up, and then they see it later on. At that point, you're going to have rain coming through, etc. It's easier for the tent to fail. I've also seen people completely miss the holes in completion and go to start putting tension up on that center pole, and guess what happens? That center pole goes right through the vinyl. So it may sound simple and cliche to say, but that's one thing that is the most important thing when putting the center pole in, is to make sure it's engaged in all the hardware it needs to be before lifting it up.
You know, Pete, this brings up a great point that I just happened to think as Davis was talking. What happens when you're lacing a tent? You drop a lace?
Yeah, here we go. So this.
Don't be that guy. Don't be that guy on the job site.
I'll give you 2 or 3 different things here. So when Bryan said drop a lace, what he's referring to is when you're weaving or lacing the tent together, you miss one of the grommets or one of the loops as you're going down. And in effect, what happens is when you go to stand the tent up, the tent will unlace itself, or it will open. So a couple of things are going to happen. One, the tent opens up and it creates, in effect, a skylight. I challenge all of my guys, and I will challenge all of the people listening to this podcast, please try and sell that as a value-added skylight.
So you don't have to do it again.
Never going to fail, but please try. The second thing that I will tell you about this is the phrase that we always use, and that is, if you drop a lace, you buy me a case.
Mm-hmm.
It's my favorite beer. And it used to be Corona, but we got this COVID thing and this and that going on, and the Corona didn't work out so well. So now I'm doing Pabst Blue Ribbon. So it's a Pabst
Good old PBRs.
tomorrow morning. If you are underage or you don't have a good fake ID or you just don't want to give me a case of beer, your other choice is you drop a lace, you take a punch in the face. Now, we hit it for this. It's good, makes you laugh, makes you think. But lacing a tent is probably the most boring, monotonous function that you can do. And if you make a mistake, it's going to cause a problem down the line that you're not going to be happy about. And that's that infamous skylight. And usually when this happens is when you're running behind and it's 80 degrees and 80% humidity and everybody's tired and everybody's bitchy and you put the tent together and you stand it up. And I will also tell you that if you're going to miss a lace, it's usually on the very last lace line that you putting the center pole into. Now, what does that mean? Well, that means you have to drop the tent all the way back down onto the ground, and you need to unlace that particular lace line, fix the problem, and then lace the tent back together and start over. So it's a big time killer.
Yeah.
But it is a very, it's a boring, monotonous type of work, but you have to pay attention to it.
It has to be right.
And it's not something you can do in the air, by the way. It has to go to the ground, right? Because of tension.
I've tried it on 2 occasions in the air. No, it does not work.
Yeah.
One other tip I will give you, if you are listening to this podcast and you happen to be the HR manager, in other words, in charge of hiring and firing of your crew, the first thing I can tell you, if you have a prospective tent installer sitting in front of you applying for a job, take a look at their shoes. If they're wearing loafers or Velcro shoes, don't hire them. They can't even touch. It's not going to be.
They wouldn't know where to start on a tent knot, would they, Pete?
Yeah, right.
Nobody knows that anymore.
No.
That's good stuff. Well, we've been going a little over an hour now. I don't necessarily have anything specific that I wanted to cover that we haven't already. I think this has been pretty thorough and exactly what we wanted to cover. We said all along, we want to bring people along with us and not take for granted what people know.
Yeah.
So I wanted to get into the top to bottom, A to Z on pole tents. We may have another session. We can get into some other things, some other time on this, but I think we've been pretty comprehensive, and I don't have anything necessarily I want to cover that we haven't already. Do you, Pete or Davis, either one?
No, not really. I think the only other thing that I find really important, and it's a very cheap, very easy thing to cure, and I see this sin quite often. And what I'm talking about on pole tents is something called a mud block or a pole pad. So basically what this is a piece of plywood. Typically it's a 3/4 inch thick piece of plywood. And for side poles, they are generally cut into 6-inch by 6-inch or 8-inch by 8-inch squares. And these mud blocks or pole pads, they go on the ground, and then the side poles go on top of them. What this does is it disperses the tension that we are introducing into the tent over a wider area, and it prevents that pole from sinking into the grass or the mud and releasing the tension or releasing all of the work that you've just done. So it's very important, very minimal cost, very easy to install, and a very simple piece. It's a piece of plywood.
Yep.
So I think that's very, very important that gets talked about. I see that on a regular basis, and I don't know if it's pure ignorance or laziness or nobody's ever showed them. I don't know what the issue is, but please, if you're in the pole tent world, make yourself a couple of big old blue barrels, the barrels you used to hold your frame tents down with, cut the tops off and wood plywood, okay? So that you have something to carry these around in. It really makes a difference. A very quick story about that. Early in my career, I had a 60-foot wide tent up in the air at a festival. It had not rained or had any moisture in Wisconsin for probably 3 months. Everything was rock hard, solid. I made the decision, for whatever reason, not to put pole pads. It's hard enough. It's hard as rock. It's never going to go anywhere. Don't worry about it. And then the skies opened up and it rained and it rained and it rained. And inevitably, I got the call the next morning, your tent is falling down. What? So I went down there. Sure enough, one whole side of this 60-foot wide tent, all of the side poles had sunk anywhere from 12 to 36 inches into now freshly soaked soil. And you know what happens when that happens? It releases all the tension on the tent. Then Mother Nature decides to blow.
Then you got pockets of water filling up too.
Simply saved ourselves less than an hour, and it cost us many hours to fix this. So use the pole pads. It's simple, it's cheap, and it's a great insurance on your investment.
And to your point, it needs to happen even on dry ground, because where's the water go when it rains? It's going to the perimeter of the tent.
Yep.
It's coming off the tent. It's going to saturate your side pole positions in your stake line.
Yep.
Simple as that.
Yes, sir. Taking it even one step farther, any pavement that is black, and I had to say, because I used to say asphalt, but some people didn't understand the difference between asphalt and concrete. So now I have white pavement and black pavement. If it's black pavement, we use them.
Yep.
Asphalt in the sunshine does get soft, and you could sink a tent in the asphalt.
I've seen it.
That's correct.
I've seen it happen. Yep.
Not have that issue, so you don't need to use them on concrete. Any other surface, you must use them.
Good deal.
Well, Pete, you going to be at tent school this year?
I'm definitely going to be at tent school.
See, there's a reason for all you listeners to come to tent school this year right there. You can meet the one and only Pete and hear everything he has to say about tents. Before we jump off, I got one story I want to hear. Bryan, tell them the story about the J-hook.
That's an anchoring thing. Pete, you tell it. Go ahead, Pete.
Having to do with tent anchoring, because go ahead.
Got to.
You want me to tell it?
Yeah.
You tell it. Yeah. As the victim.
The victim.
Davis tent school. Tent school happens in December, I believe roughly the first week in December every year in South Carolina or on the road. And this is a very hands-on tent school. It is not a dog and pony show. We actually are installing things. We're teaching things. And one of the things that I do is a demonstration called the holding power of stakes. And what I do is I take all the various different stakes that are out there, and we drive them into the ground, and we attach it to a scale or a dynamometer to measure the force that these stakes will resist, so that we can get an idea of what size stake needs to be used with what size tent and so on. Well, there's one stake called a J-hook stake, which is typically 5/8 of an inch in diameter and roughly 18 inches long, that used to be kind of the standard for these smaller party canopies. It was kind of a price point stake that if somebody needed to meet a price point, they could substitute an $11 stake for a $4 stake and that type of thing. I hated those stakes. I just felt they had no place in our industry. And if y'all know me, I am sometimes not politically correct, and sometimes I don't put the filter on. And I stood up in front of everybody at the Top Tech school. I told them, this stake has no place in the commercial tent rental industry. Unfortunately, I didn't know Top Tech was selling that with their party canopies. So, ouch. Anyway, fast forward to a couple of years down the road, Bryan gives me a call and he says, hey, we're doing a stake demonstration. Would you send us the lineup of how they go, and we'll make sure they get into the ground so you don't have to do it when you get down here. And I thought, wow, this is fabulous. I don't have to break a sweat. I just get to come down and be a talking head. So I come down and be the talking head. And the first stake that I'm faced with is the J-hook stake. And I go into my typical spiel. This doesn't belong here. It's going to fail at 150 or 200 pounds. Don't use these stakes. We applied the force to it. and dynamometer read 100 pounds, and I'm waiting for this steak to pull out of the ground. And then it went 200, 250, 300, 500, 700, 1,500, 1,700, 2,000 pounds. And I don't know I do not know what's going on.
I did.
Really. Well, I stopped there and said, I don't know what's going on. I saw Bryan out of the corner of my eye. I had an inkling something was going on, but I didn't know. So I continued in my demonstration. We get to the end of the demonstration, and I go back to that darn J-hook steak, and I try to figure out what's going on. He finally clues me in. He took that steak to the metal shop at Top Tech, and he had their metal guys weld a 2-inch diameter or 3-inch diameter flute onto the steak, and he basically made it a screw-in auger steak.
I thought it was great.
The best get back ever. But you know what? It also has been one of the best stories that I've been able to tell whenever I do this demonstration, because it brings up the point that I try to nail down to all of you guys that are installing tents. And it's these simple words: size does not.
Yep, that's right.
Yep. So Pete ended up taking that fluted steak, putting it on a plaque and painting it and sending it back to me.
Downs ever.
Yep.
So does matter. Great practical joke. I felt like such a fool standing there telling everybody that this thing was going to fail. It sucks. Don't use it. And yet it outperforms some of the steaks that we normally use. So, story. Size does matter, guys.
I love it. So with that, let's put a bow on episode 4 of the Pitchin Tents podcast. Pete, I can't thank you enough for joining us.
Yeah, I appreciate it.
It's been great. I knew it was going to be good. There's a reason we have you help us year after year after year, and can't thank you enough. And appreciate the friendship and what you meant to us over the years.
Anybody tuning in, whether you are a 40-year veteran like me or this is your first year, please make plans to come to Moore, South Carolina. I believe that's where we're going to be. We're not going on the road this.
That's correct.
That's the plan. That's the plan right now.
Please come to South Carolina first week in December. The weather's awesome. If you're from the Northern Hemisphere like I am, above the Mason-Dixon line, it's a hell of a nice vacation. Warm weather, bunch of tent guys, and we all got vinyl flowing through our veins. And thank you, guys.
Thank you, Pete.
Appreciate it, guys. I'm good, man. That's great. I appreciate y'all.
Yep, same here. All right, we'll see you in a couple weeks.
All right.
Thanks.
Later, taters.